Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next BCIG webinar. So if, as we go through the meeting, feel free to do Q&A or raise your hand, type stuff in the chat if that's easier for you. So we're really excited to be doing another webinar today. Today's an exciting day for me because it's 30 years today that I started my first job as a cochlear implant audiologist. So I wish you were all here to have like cakes and ice cream with me this afternoon. But more exciting than that, things have really moved on, obviously, in the past 30 years, most of all my kind of eye bags and wrinkles. And as you know, I'm very keen on remote care for people who want it. And we've got some exciting tools around at the moment. And one of these, of course, is Cochlear's Remote Check. And I know most of us have used it to some extent, but maybe not as systematically as the Nottingham Auditory Implant Programme has. So it's really exciting for us to hear today about the first 500 remote checks at the Nottingham Auditory Implant Programme. And probably they've even done more than 500 now, I would say. So I'm really happy to introduce Kim Viekmans, and she's a clinical scientist in audiology at the Nottingham Auditory Implant Programme. So as I say, feel free to ask questions in the chat, raise your hand, do the Q&A. Let's make it quite interactive as we go along. Okay, Kim, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and congratulations. 30 years is quite a bit. Yes, I would like to talk today about our experience with Remote Check. I think I asked almost a year ago about getting our data from the cloud from Cochlear and having a look. So yeah, we've done a few more than 500 now, and I just thought I'll just share with you all our experience of Remote Check in the Nottingham Auditory Implant Program. So I thought give you a quick overview. We'll talk a little bit about Remote Check at our program, and then which patient data does Remote Check collect. I know that some of you use it, but other people might have not used it very much yet. Which patients complete Remote Checks? When do they do Remote Checks? What have we seen in all the completed data at NAPE, and then a bit more into depth about the data that you collect in Remote Check. So I think we are very keen on patient-led assessment and care at NAPE, and sorry, this is not coming up very well. There we go. In the past, it was always face-to-face, and then obviously the pandemic has changed things dramatically for everyone. And we were doing more video and telephone appointments, and we also broadened our patient group that did Remote Check. So we changed it a little bit again after the pandemic, in that we did fewer video and telephone appointments, but Remote Check kind of stayed on the pathway. So when we look at our pathway preoperatively, we do some clinic face-to-face appointments in assessment, but we also do a few video appointments in assessment, where we do like the history taking and an overview of everything that's been discussed in assessment, which we do via doctor. And then obviously surgery is in hospital. Then the early days appointments and switch on appointments, we mainly do in clinic again. But we can also put Remote Checks in there. And then we do annual reviews, essential reviews and optional reviews, and screening, triage, emergency appointments. And for that, we use a lot of Remote Check. So we have incorporated Remote Check mostly in the post-operative care for our CI patients. And in doing that, we refined the screening system that we use. So we can now use it for most of the cochlear patients that we have on the program. And actually, think we have about 1,200 cochlear patients, maybe about 1,600 cochlear ears on the program. So most of them can now do a remote check if they are on a Nucleus 7 or a Nucleus 8 or a Kanso 2 processor. The Nucleus 22 patients cannot yet, but all the 24s and the CI 500 and 600 series can. And we identify them with a little star if they have the right equipment, and we identify them with a C for cochlear remote check, CRC, if they have done a remote check before, so that we know what they have done in the past, and we can be flexible and giving them face-to-face appointments and then back onto remote check. The invitation to undertake remote check was changed. Initially, it was more of a feasibility study, and then now we are inviting them in clinic. In the early days, we invite them in their appointment letters, basically when their appointments are due, and a non-response rate has then gone down dramatically. We set up in Auditory a web-based waiting list and a booking system. And I think on the web-based waiting list, we currently have 103 patients. So that's a waiting list for the whole year. Every month we have a look who's on that list and who needs to do a remote check. And as refinements happened in remote check, both in the portal and on our database, we were able to broaden that patient group even further. So the pathway has been modified so that we can make the appointment format suit the patients and their needs. So this is our current pathway in general for pediatrics and adult patients. So the early days or the early week appointments are in clinic. Then the 3 or 6 month appointments can be in clinic, but actually if there's not that much to be gained from face-to-face contact, then it can also be a remote check. And if the patient's doing well and they're capable of using the technology. The 1 year appointment is always in clinic. And then the 2 year appointment can be remote check or can be again in clinic. Essential reviews where we want to do programming is mostly in clinic, and then optional reviews can be, if needed, they can be in clinic. But I think we're trying to steer the patient more towards remote checks if they can do this. So we use the remote check via the Nucleus Smart app. So it will come up for them to say your check is due. And it will ask them to take some pictures of their implant site, to answer the questionnaire, to do an audiogram, to do the triple digit test in noise. And it will take some measurements automatically, like the implant test, etc. This is just how they do the test. And then it comes into the portal, we review it, and we send them feedback. So we look at the implant site and the scar. We look at the internal and external device. We also look at the data logging it collects automatically. And we look at the objective and subjective hearing check. So since we were able to enable or disable certain tests, we can really use it for patients at all stages, and also younger patients who would not be able to do the hearing tests themselves. We just disable those, and we send the checks through just for the impedances or for the questionnaire for parents, whatever is needed for that patient. We are looking at cochlear remote care, where you can make some changes to the program, but there's no actual programming possible yet via remote check. So then in the portal, this is an overview. We look at the questions that need our attention. We look at the impedances. I still compare back to CS Pro to just check how stable things are, especially maybe for some of the devices that have a bit more variability in their impedances. There used to be some information about compliance, which there isn't now. So it's worth noting that if impedances do fluctuate a little bit, and they keep fluctuating, to keep looking back, because if there's not much headroom, you might be getting out of compliance without realizing it, and you might have to bring patients back into clinic. We look at the audiogram and the difference between the previous audiogram. We look at the speech and noise test, the hardware information, and then the pictures that are sent through. And then we also have a look at the data logging. I quite like the data logging in the portal. I've just done two views here. One is the kind of month overview, and the other is kind of the whole period of the remote check. And it gives you that little bit more detail rather than just a donut that you see in CS Pro. It is worth noting that there is a little bug in there. So sometimes if the processors haven't been connected all the time, or there has been some disruption with the streaming, the connection between the processors and the app, you get some missing data, and sometimes the missing data gets taken into the average. So your average might look like it's really low, but your actually daily data that is there is always kind of 12 to 14 hours, but it's taking all those zeros into account, and then it's not correct. So it's um, worth having a look at that in a bit more detail. So who complete remote checks? So I think when we were doing it for a couple of years, we took part in a survey with Cochlear, and they published a little white paper on real world experience using Cochlear remote check in the United Kingdom. Um, and so our data is part of the overall data on the top there. And I think it showed nicely that all different age groups could use remote check and did use remote check. And then we had a further look into our own data for our patients. And at the time, this was just before we could offer it to the Nucleus 24 patients. So you see that there's quite a lot of data there for younger people, and also quite a lot of data for seniors there. However, there was fewer data for the young adults, and I think that was to do with the fact that their implants, a lot of young adults would have Nucleus 24s from when they were younger, wasn't compatible at the time. So at the moment that has changed, and there will be more data there for the young adults as well, but the age range is between 1 and 87.5. So there's quite a lot of the older adults who do it on their iPad. Cochlear doesn't recommend it on their iPad, but I think they spend a lot of time on their iPad and find that maybe a bit more user friendly than a computer. So they do send through their checks, and sometimes you get a carer sending through the check, which is lovely. This is data that we collected then after the pandemic to see when we were really pushing for remote check in terms of when are people doing it, and it was a little bit varied. All different appointments could be done by a remote check. More so the kind of annual reviews and the optional appointments, more so, but we also did it really early stages. Going back to our pathway now, we did come back a little bit from the stages where we felt that patients were asking a lot of questions in the remote check and were indicating maybe on the SSQ that they were having issues with a number of situations that we would kind of as a professional think would be very normal. So where we felt like counseling and more of that face-to-face contact was more useful for them to have that feedback saying it's fine, it's normal, these situations will remain hard, or they're still hard. We've gone back to saying it's probably better to see those patients in clinic, that you can have that conversation face to face, or even over video appointment, rather than having to type it all out and them having to read it all. I think it's more reassuring to do that, but it's definitely possible for patients who are confident and doing well. So I took a screenshot a few days ago. So I think we've done 655 remote checks. And this shows you, I'm not sure if it's clear, that 80% of them we said everything's fine, there's no other action needed. We'll book you another check, either a repeat check or an annual review check. And 9% on there says a clinic appointment is needed. When we first started a couple of years ago, there was a third option which said other action. And I think that other action was often, please change your cable, please change your processor, things like that, where people were reporting that they had issues or reporting intermittency, or maybe the audiogram wasn't as good as it was before, and that we recommended another action. Or it could also be if there was some redness on the scar or on the implant side, that we recommended to go to the GP or get a medical opinion. But actually 80% of them, it says everything's fine, you're doing really well, we have no concerns, your results are good, your device is stable, we'll see you for your next check next year, or we'll see your next check next year. So this year we've done 118 remote checks so far. So we do about 12 or 13 per month. I think we were doing more during and just after the pandemic, it's gone down a little bit, where people have maybe done 2 or 3 checks in a row, and then we've now said, let's come back into clinic, let's check your programming. Or maybe patients have done some emergency checks and then they just go back on the kind of more clinical clinic pathway again. We have 193 patients on the web-based list at the moment, so they're all due in the next year, and 69 patients on the monthly waiting list. Those are patients who have done 1 or 2 or more remote checks in the past, and they've now then come in for a face-to-face again, and they will go, if all is fine, back on the remote check after that face-to-face appointment then. So the data from the 500 checks, we requested the data from Cochlear, and they did a data drop of all the questionnaire data, all the hardware health data, speech and noise data, and the audiograms. So there's 500 checks there from 262 patients. So some patients have just done 1 check, some have done multiple ones, and some have done more than 1. Yes. So the questionnaire data, there is an adult and a parent version, so an adult and a pediatric version of the questionnaire with respectively 30 and 38 questions. The questions investigate and identify all kinds of issues related to training needs, medical status, fitting parameters, device components, sound quality, how they're doing in general, but anything also to do with their external equipment, and any issues relating to their hearing or their implant side. Questions 10 to 21 in the adult version are the 12 questions from the SSQ 12, and questions 8 to 30 in the pediatric or parent questionnaire are 23 questions from the SSQ for parents. This is a little extract from Cochlear. They did a nice paper for professionals, and they advised that if there is a difference in the questions in terms of how they answer the questions from the SSQ of 1 step, it's flagged up that there needs to be, that you need to look at it, and that there is a difference. We had so much data because there's like 30 questions for every patient, and some patients had done it 3 or 4 times, that it was a bit overwhelming. So we haven't been able to look at that one yet, but observation also just from doing the checks, patients when they tick, for example, oh, I can't do this or I can't do that, and it is an issue, they tend to also put some comments in there as well. They tend to report it. So sometimes you see slight issues where things have moved 1 or 2 steps here or there, but there's no comments at all. And then we do reassure, and we ask, if you have any worries, let us know. But if all the tests in general are fine, we just give them reassurance. But if there are a few questions where they have ticked, for example, I find it harder to concentrate, or I find it harder to listen in noise, and they've also put some comments down saying, I think I'm not hearing as well, then we kind of look at that and we see if we want to see them in clinic. The hardware health is where it checks the processor and the microphone, and so there was lots of data points because the checks are done for unilaterals and bilaterals, and only 9 times out of those more than, well, almost 700 data points was there a processor fault detected, so kind of only 1%. When we questioned initially with Cochlear, they said, well, it could be a processor fault, but it could also be that the processor has been disconnected during the testing from the app, so that there's a streaming issue. And we then decided, well, if we're not sure, whenever it brings up a fault, we're going to ask them to replace the processor with Cochlear Care. There was no microphone faults detected in any of our remote checks. And I think lately we've had some missing data where it hasn't been connected for long enough to the app for it to collect enough data. And that wasn't the case initially, but in the last year, if it's not connected long enough, it doesn't seem to always pick it up. So we flagged that with Cochlear. But just looking at that, just really kind of high level, I'm not sure how much it would pick up, because it's a little bit suspicious that there's no microphone faults detected at all. So it might not be quite sensitive enough. So we do also look at the audiogram and look at things, but obviously it bypasses the microphone protector. So if there's any issue with that, you wouldn't know. But it's if there is an issue with the audiogram systematically being worse, then we just recommend to replace the processor, even if there's no processor faults logged. So this is the speech and noise data, the digit triple test. We looked at test retest to start with for 74 patients. And as you can see, it's quite a good correlation. It's a strong correlation indicating a good test retest. You can see kind of in blue there, the range of outcomes is kind of between -2 and -8, which is really good with some outliers on either side. I think average, we had an SRT for adults of -4.3 and peds -4.6. And it's almost exact same as a paper that Cochlear also reported on in their white paper from Marutar Kara, I'm hoping I say that right, who also looked at that, and their patient group was slightly smaller, but it was almost the exact same result, so that's reassuring. If we look at the distribution, it's largely even between plus and -2 dB, which is like a few outliers, a few reporting greater differences between the two measures. So this suggests that kind of plus or -2 decibel represents an expected variability in that test. So, and that's where we go from as well. If the triple digit test says -4 and next time it's -6, we say that's great. If it's -4 and next time it's -2, it's fine. But once that the variability gets bigger, then we think, oh, maybe we need to look at whether there are any issues. This is the audiogram data. I just add a little look at the averages for adults on the top and pediatrics, and then also for bilateral and unilateral. So it's very similar, as you can see. It's kind of almost the same for all of them. So the adults are mainly the unilaterals. There's a few bilateral adults who were peds implanted bilaterally are now in the adult range. And there's a few, but not very many, unilateral peds, but generally it's similar. So you can see that for the lower frequencies, 250 and 500 hertz, it's kind of around 20. And then for all the others, it's between 15 and 17, I would say. We do sometimes see, especially in the adults, levels of kind of 10, 12 dBHL, and it's quite low. And then I would say, I would make a note that next time they come in for programming, that we see if we can drop the thresholds, because that just seems very, very sharp. Looking at test retest in 64 adult patients, the correlations were quite strong for 1, 2, 4, and 6K, moderate for 3 and 500, but quite weak for 250. And I think that's, we did also anecdotally pick that up, that could be quite variable. I'm not quite sure if somebody has an idea why that would be, but it's something that we'll flag with Cochlear to see why that is not that reliable. So if you look at the 250 hertz, the trend line also shows that weak correlation, reflecting like a greater variability and an uneven scatter of differences. Also in that lower graph, I'm not sure if that's clear enough. So the difference is around 0, but then you've got quite a few outliers and a bit more variability there. If you then contrast that with the 6K, which had a very strong correlation, there is a flatter distribution of those differences in that bottom plot. And there's also a few outliers, but fewer. Most of them are around that 0 mark of difference. So in summary, now that remote check is more customizable, we can use it with a very wide range of patients, like very young patients where parents want to just check if the implant is okay, if they had a bang to the head or something, for example, to also older patients. Also patients who are BSL users, we might disable the triple digit, although some do it, and just do the audiogram and the questions and the internal checks. So it's quite nice because apart from the N22s, we can use it with almost everyone now. We use it for the routine checks, the annual reviews. We also use it sometimes for triaging before clinic appointments or for emergency checks. We built it into the pathway. Depending on how you build it into your pathway, it can become your actual appointment, or it can just be like an additional check before you do your clinic appointment. We still do a lot of admin with regard to remote check, in terms of making sure that if they are on the waiting list, they actually have a check selected for that time, making sure that we chase people who haven't done their checks. Some checks are optional, so we just roll them over to the next year. Other checks are essential because we want to know something, so we do have to then sometimes chase patients. They get some emails from Cochlear to let them know, but tends to be when we chase that they then go, okay, yeah, let's do that. Some patients are not bothered until they have a problem, and then there's still a check waiting, and they'll use that. And then we'll just create an extra appointment. That's fine. We are upskilling more of our audiologists to do the review of the data and decide on the next steps in the pathway. That has always been the idea, that we kind of upskill our associates to do that. But at the moment, I think there is still kind of some stuff to be learned as to which patients and what data do we look at to kind of bring them into clinic, and where can we say, actually, that's totally fine. We don't need any more information. We're quite happy, though they might have raised one or two things. We are able to help them just via email or with a short phone call. But that's the plan, to kind of get the associates more involved, and then maybe do some triaging on the check and move the checks that need more attention onto the audiologists. So the hardware health, we're not sure how useful it is. And as I said, patients tend to report, and the audiogram tends to help you identify if there's any processor issues. We always look at it, but given looking at the data, I'm not quite sure. The triple digit test is excellent. It's good test, retest reliability, and the expected variability is about 2 dB, which is fine. The audiogram, there is some good and some weak retest reliability. I think only the 250 hertz is maybe an issue, and we'll discuss that with Cochlear. We will look at the questionnaire further in more detail. And then the data logging, I think, as I said before, it's really useful to have that additional information, but do look through your graphs to see what the averages represent, because there are some issues with those zero values being calculated in the average, or when it's not connected enough that it doesn't give you the right values. And sometimes when people connect it to 2 apps or to 2 tablets or 2 phones, you can get a bit of cumulative data that doesn't seem to make sense. So it's worth looking at that into detail. So then I just wanted to say thank you to Derek for helping analyze some of the audiogram and triple digit data. And thank you all for listening, and any questions. I'm not sure if anybody got a word in edgeways once I got going. I'm sorry, but if there's any questions, yeah, go ahead.
Amazing. Thanks, Kim. It's so great to see such a massive amount of data, and I love your plots that you've done. So interesting, those ones like for the triple digit test, where you show the kind of the difference, and mostly, as you say, plus or minus 2. So we do remote check a reasonable amount in Southampton, and things I find a bit annoying are the fact that you can't compare the impedances with custom sound at the moment, can you? But I think that is coming. So it's kind of annoying to have 2 screens on the go at once. And I still think that some, we still have some patients with phone models that can't use remote check still, and that kind of goes into like a big cycle of us trying to get help from Cochlear, and some parts of it work and some parts of it don't work, but I guess that will disappear over time.
Yeah, when the technology works, it's really quite amazing. But that we do have technical problems where older patients, for example, who haven't updated their app or their iOS system, or patients who are trying to create different accounts in the background for different parents for children, or one parent for 2 children. So there are still some issues there. I think there's a couple of questions maybe in the
sure, right, let's
chat.
So yeah, can you see the questions, Kim? Yeah, so Nicole has said she's curious about quality of life scores and rehab and how you feel it fits in with the model.
Yeah, I think so that's where we initially, when we did more remote check in the pandemic in the early stages, where we felt that they needed more maybe input from the speech and language therapist, or more input from we don't have a hearing therapist anymore in the team, but a hearing therapist or speech and language therapist, where even if people are doing really well, if they've forgotten, I'm sure it's been talked about preoperatively, but in the early stages where it goes, oh, everything is amazing, I can hear it, and suddenly they realize actually there's still quite a lot of things I struggle with and that are hard, then we felt like they needed more counseling, they needed more rehab, and doing that over email is not really appropriate. Then we went back to offering some via video, or now face to face, where even if the programming seems fine, if we feel a patient needs that reassurance in the early stages or later stages when something has happened, some people are fine with reassuring them via the check and just sending an email, and some people, you can tell from the tone that they're panicking about something, and you just bring them into clinic. That's absolutely fine. um, the, it will be interesting to see what the questionnaire data says, and I think in our standard response we have like a sentence saying um, the questionnaire the questionnaire questions are standard. They're not appropriate for everyone. If you are a patient who only has one cochlear implant, or whose main mode of communication isn't spoken language, or who's in the very early stages, it's very normal that you might say you can't do these things. So to preempt that a little bit, we did put that in after the first checks, because people were answering questions that we thought maybe we would have not necessarily asked them at this stage, but they're in the remote check, so they're there. We can't take specific questions out.
So where do you say that to them then? In how do you get it to add that information?
So we do a lot via email. So when we enroll somebody, we send a standard email saying you're now enrolled. This is what you need to do. We will check. Once we receive the check, we will give you feedback within so many days. Please be aware that this. Please be aware that. So we do give them some information, but also when a check is finished, we decided over time, it's been back and forward, but at the moment, what we're doing in the last kind of couple of years is that we send feedback via the app to say, please look in your email for more detailed feedback. Mainly because if you start communicating with them in the app, that appointment remains open. And so we felt like if this is an appointment, we want to finish that appointment, and then we will follow up with the patient as we normally do via telephone or via email, but we don't use that function in the remote check. So we have a specific remote check email address. So we still do a lot of follow up via that. And then if it feels like that email is not appropriate for the patient, we will do an appointment or a telephone call or whatever. But it's very much tailored to what they need at that point.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, a question from Nicola Wilmot. When you register a patient for a remote check, it initially does a baseline test. In the early stages, like 3 or 6 months, do you use that as the baseline test, or do you make them do a test immediately after the appointment, in which you put them on the waiting list so that you have that one for comparison? So I guess kind of how good do you think it is to do a baseline at 3 or 6 months?
So it varies. It varies when you start to do the remote check. So sometimes the baseline counts as their actual appointment, and then the other one. So with the repeat, because you always have two, one of them counts as their actual appointment, and one of them counts, we call it an enrollment appointment. And sometimes we can make that and coincide with both appointments. So let's say if we think it's appropriate for somebody to do their 6 months appointment as a remote check, then that 6 months becomes their first remote check. And then the 3 months later is a 9 month. We would normally not do a 9-month appointment, but we leave that there. Just said, that's your repeat check. Please do that as an interim appointment, just to kind of see if that's stable. If they don't do it and we see them at 1 year in the clinic, which is what their normal pathway would be, 6 months and then 1 year, then that enrollment appointment, we don't necessarily, we'll chase it once, and then if they don't want to do it, that's fine. We'll see them in clinic anyway. If, for example, somebody's been in clinic and maybe some measures haven't been done because there was no time, or there's something else we want to check, we might put that enrollment appointment straight after clinic, and then we might put the repeat appointment when we actually need to see them for their next appointment. That could be 3 months, that could be 6 months. So we're quite flexible. We do always put both of them in, but only one of them counts as their actual appointment when we want to see them. And sometimes we leave it 3 months, but if somebody were to do their appointment as their first remote check and something isn't quite right, then we bring that 3 month forward to like 2 weeks after that, and we say, please get a new processor, and I'll bring your remote check forward, and we'll do it again in 2 weeks to see if that makes it better. So we use that very flexible, really. I don't know if that answers the
Makes
question.
sense, yeah. Okay, and at what age, Rianne is asking, what age do you start speech testing with pediatric patients?
We initially said 7, but the other day, one of the associates just sent a full check to somebody accidentally, and that's fine. And they did it, and they were 5, and they did all the tests, all of them. And I was so impressed. A little boy who's 5, we did 2 audiograms and 2 triple-digit tests, and the mum helped him through all of it. They said they did one ear on the evening, and the next day in the morning they did the other ear. But yeah, I did send them an email saying I'm so impressed for a 5-year-old to do all of that by himself, because you have to think that parent can't hear what's going on. That's just streamed to their ears. They just have to do all of that by themselves. So I sent him a little like well done email, and mom said it went okay. I sat with him, I held the phone, and he just did it all. So I don't think there's many 5-year-olds who would be able to do that. So we normally say we send it around the age of 7, but there are a few exceptions clearly who can.
Brilliant. Okay, Mira from Cambridge, have you developed a protocol or a list of red flags that would help your associates to know when action is needed? So when you need to bring the patient to the clinic for further programming or whatever.
So we haven't passed it over to the associates yet. We've just been training some of the younger audiologists to do that, and that is part of my next step. So there was 3 of us who were doing it, 3 audiologists who've worked here for a long time, and I think would be fine deciding. And actually, when we're not sure, we discuss it amongst each other anyway. If it's a patient that somebody else has seen in clinic and I see them from remote check, I might go back to them and say, that's come up. Do you think you need to see them again in clinic, or shall I just put another check in and see what happens? So we do have that discussion. But yes, with some of the junior audiologists at the moment, we're just kind of seeing if we need to maybe make the rules a bit clearer, rather than as senior audiologists, you've kind of got those decisions in your head for other appointments as well. What do I do? How quickly do I bring them back? What can we do? So yeah, that's a good point. And that's what we need to do before we pass it on to the associates, I think, because you need to know which questions to ask before you can ask them. Almost, you need to know what would be a red flag, but we haven't done that yet. No, that's our next job.
Sure, thank you. Okay, let's have a live question. So Joe McDonough from the Scottish programme. Joe, your microphone is on. Oh, perhaps message me when you're ready. Okay, back to the chat. How much time are you setting aside on a weekly basis for a remote check? How do you record the results? Are you adding screenshots? And I guess I want to add on to that. Are you doing a report to anybody, like to the patient or the GP? Because I know Darvel from St George's does a really impressive report, and we haven't done that at all. So tell us what you guys are doing.
Yes, so I think we have 2 sessions a week, and a patient session for us is an hour and a half, and we do 2 or 3 remote checks in that session. Some weeks there is none, and then when I used to do it, I then do quite a bit of the remote check admin. Obviously, we also need to review the remote check email address to see what patients come back with, and if anybody's emailed in to say I want to do one. So there's a little bit of admin in that time as well, but we tend to have 2 remote check sessions a week for 2 audiologists. What we do is we kind of, in the remote check itself, there's for every test or for every section you can put in notes. So we put very standard notes in there, and I copy and paste that back into their audit-based session, so that on audit-based you have all your sessions, and one session might have been clinic, one session might have been remote check, one session might have been a video appointment, but they're all in the same place so that you can go through them and see the notes. So it's just a copy and paste kind of job. We used to do reports the same as we did for every appointment. We then checked with, I think, iQuips, I can't remember. We checked whether we had to do a report, and I think the conclusion was only if there's diagnostic information. So if something needs, there's something new or something needs attention. So let's say they send a picture through and it's a really red mark and they need to be seen immediately by a GP, we would probably do a letter to the GP saying this, like you would also do for a normal appointment, please see this patient, and we would advise the patient to go to their GP. But generally our feedback is like a standard template in an email to the patient. So we stopped doing the reports because it wasn't necessary, and also we're trying to be more paperless. So then I felt a bit strange to send them paper reports in the post. So we're doing most of it via email, but if we have to, we do also send letters. Does that make
Brilliant.
sense?
Yeah, and talking about photos, we had a remote check one a couple of weeks ago where the patient sent a photo and it was of their slippers. So I think they'd got like front mic and rear mic the wrong way around. So that was very nice. Okay, next question, Alex Foster from South Tees. If the patient's doing well with remote check, how often do you bring them in for a clinic appointment?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? So for adults, we have a protocol that you have to touch base every 5 years at least. If an adult is doing well with remote check and they don't report any problems and they request new equipment and everything looks fine, then I think that it's fine for them to do remote checks and for 4 or maybe even longer if they really don't want to come in. But generally our rule is kind of do 4 remote checks and then invite them back into clinic to just check the programming, just check that they're in compliance. And I think there might be in terms of the impedances and compliance, there's certain devices where you have a bit more of a worry, and other devices like the 24s and the Freedoms, they are so dead on, those impedances, so stable, whereas maybe the 622s and the 522s, they fluctuate and they variate a bit more. So if there's a worry about impedances, I would bring them back. But otherwise for adults, I would say maybe every 5 years, peds every 3 years. But also because pediatric programming changes so much more in the earlier years than adult programming would change, I would say. So I'm always reluctant to leave a pediatric patient for too long, because by the time you see them again, you'll have to make big changes, which they don't like. It's better to every few years make a small change here and there, and then they're back on track. So yeah, pediatric 3, I would say, adults 5.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, I just had a request that to make you a bit bigger so we can see you better, to stop sharing your presentation. But in fact, you can just click on Kim's face and then she will come up big on your screen, or she certainly did for me. Okay, Leah, a question from you. How does your finance department work out budgets and charging system? Are patients charged annually for care?
I'm not an expert. So Cheryl, our procurement manager, does that. Commissioning manager does that. So she does count. She does a count up of appointments. So even, for example, also if we offer a remote check and they don't do it, there's a note somewhere to say we offered the appointment. So she looks at all the appointments, what we offer them and what care we offer, and she decides that budget. I wouldn't know myself how it is counted. So for example, for patients who are non-users, they might not have a budget anymore for that care. And if we know that they're non-users, but everybody's who's in the system, I think it's counted by her as to how many virtual, how many remote checks, how many face-to-face. But I'm sorry, I don't really know how that gets charged.
No worries. Yeah, I tend to keep out
I can
of that
check. I
stuff
can
as
check
well.
though. I can check for you if you really want to know though.
Oh, so a question about the iPad. So you said that lots of the older adults, of course, are using iPads, not smartphones. And what's the problem with this? Sarah is asking.
I don't think it's a problem, but the app is not designed to be displayed on the iPad like it is on the iPhone or on a Samsung phone. So I think we always send, when we send an invitation or an enrollment, we always send like a screenshot of the compatibility. So on the screenshot, if you go on Cochlear, it says which devices are compatible with which, what of their apps, and all of that tells you what iOS you need and what internal, what external, and then also what kind of device you can do it on. But we have also added the iPads on there and the iPad minis, and they're aware of that, but they say that they themselves don't recommend it because I think some of the screens might look a bit funny because it's not designed for that screen format. I think that's all it is.
Another question from Mira in Cambridge. Have you analysed the amount of time you're spending on follow-up to prove that it's better than bringing the patient to clinic? So thinking about the kind of admin and clinical time that you're using for remote check.
So that, I think that is, if you look at different clinics who use remote check, I think there's a few bigger clinics in the UK who use remote check quite substantially. We have always said that it's not 20 minutes. I think Cochlear promotes and says it's 20 minutes, and it is 20 minutes to just look at that check. But I think for any appointment that you do, if you just look at that moment in time, you're doing your patient a disservice. So for us, I do look back at what they did before. I look back at what I think, how many remote checks they've done and should they come into clinic. I do look back at what maybe their aided levels were before. Have they always, had one or two where they were struggling? So actually that's not a problem. That's how their aided always looks. Comparing back with the impedances, so that you do spend more time. So I think we do spend, for a patient appointment for an adult, either 60 or 90 minutes in clinic, and then there could still be some follow-up, because it might be that you have to ring Cochlear Care to authorize something, or that you want to speak to a speech and language therapist to discuss something, or local professionals. For remote checks, we count 45 minutes to do all of it. But then you might have the next day that you go and check the email address to see if they've said, yeah, I did change the microphone covers, I'm just going to do this now, or I have already changed my cable, so I'm going to request a new processor, or things like that. So I think it is not as it is time saving. It's not as time saving as it seems, because if you want it to be an appointment in your patient pathway, you have to do all the other bits that you normally do for patients as well. But the remote check itself, the time that you spend looking at that data, is probably shorter than what you would do spending time in clinic with them. But you're right, it's not a 20 minutes, and actually we can do 3 patients in the space of one. I would say if you spend 90 minutes in clinic, a remote check for all the admin and the remote check is about 45 minutes for us.
Okay, I mean, that is still a significant saving, isn't it? And of course, we have to bear in mind the saving for the patient as well,
Exactly.
in terms of their time and their expense.
They don't have to
hassle.
they don't have to travel. They don't have to they don't have to travel. They don't have to pay for petrol. All of those things. They don't have to take time off work.
Sure. Okay, so Jo from Scotland, she's typed her question now. So at the Scottish Cochlear Implant Programme, they have done 586 remote checks, 225 adults, 21 children. And she's asking, how successful have you been engaging with your repeat non-attenders? And how many, or have you had any clients that want to be unenrolled from remote check?
Yeah, so I think the for non-attenders, it either goes one way or the other. Some people are just not engaging, and they wouldn't engage with remote check, and they don't engage with clinic appointments either. Some people don't attend because they find it hard to get to us, maybe older people or people who have children with additional needs, who have lots of appointments and other children at home, and just can't make that work. For them, it has worked. I think some of the older adults, who don't really travel that much anymore, and they have somebody who does it with them, it has worked quite well, because otherwise we would have not seen them. For some of the more complex kids where parents just go, I can't make it, I have other appointments, I have other children at home, and we then say, well, let's send you a remote check, and can you just do it in your own time? Your child doesn't have to do anything, it will automatically get the data, all you have to do is answer the questions and take a picture, and they do that as well. So it's a bit variable depending on why they don't attend. um, we do chasing quite a bit, and it is a little bit, when patients need something or when they are worried, they will do the remote check. When they're fine, they just let it roll over, and we can chase and we can check, and actually they just don't do it. We do, if we say the remote check is essential, we chase it up, and don't just roll over, because then we go, well, actually, if you're not doing the remote check, which is what we agreed, then you should come into clinic, because we need to have this information. We want to know whether this implant site has healed, or whether, you know, whether it's still too loud for your child, or which maps are you know, whatever it is that we set that remote check up for in the first place. If we haven't got that information, you'll have to come into clinic for it.
That's fair enough, isn't
So
it?
it's a bit varied. It depends on why people are non-attenders.
I mean, what you're saying, Kim, makes me think that maybe the next stage of this is, so obviously it's great to be able to do this stuff remotely, but it's still clinic led, isn't it? It's still us saying, right, it's October the 20th, it's a year since you've had your implant, I want you to do a remote check. So do you think the next stage with this is to make it patient led, that the patient can decide when they want to do remote check? Or is that opening up a whole new set of nightmares? You know, some patients will do it every single day, won't they?
Yeah, I think there's not that, we've got one or two who if we would let them, would do it every month and have another complaint every time they do it, and they're doing really well, because then they ring you on the phone saying, I can't hear, but you're talking to me on the phone. But actually, I think for the annual reviews for adults who have had their implant for quite a few years, they tend to do it when they want to do it. And then we just roll over, and then we invite them into clinic again. And that does also not always. Some patients you can send any invitation and they just don't respond. But most of them, I would say, they kind of do it when they feel they need it, or when they want some reassurance. I think in the early stages, or the children, I would be more reluctant that somebody falls through the net if you don't have that waiting list where you think, actually, we should check in with them. Um,
And what is the window on the invitation then? So if a patient receives an invitation, how long can they leave it for before it expires?
I think the invitation, the check, if you set it up, as long as they don't start it, it's there, and they can pick it up for whenever.
Oh,
But
okay.
because we have them on a waiting list, so that's part of some of the admin we do. Like, it's October now. They've had a couple of extra weeks, but we are looking at the patients who did not do their remote check in September, and what do we do with them? So some of them who have maybe been enrolled and not done it at all, we might just move them away from the web-based waiting list, because we've chased them, we've agreed it with them, they haven't done it. We've chased them, they haven't done it. We've given them another week and they haven't done it. So let's just move them on to just an optional waiting list, and that will go back to face whenever those 5 years are up. Um,
Makes
if
sense.
if somebody, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say now. I think if you completely leave it into patient hands, for adults who are doing well and are just going steady and know what they need to do with their equipment, I don't think we're that worried. We check in with them, and we send them invitations, but
Mhm.
that's absolutely fine. But I would be a bit more worried for children, maybe, and maybe people if they don't engage in the early days, that's a bit of a red flag, isn't it?
I guess you have like another level on top of remote check, because you do your own emails, don't you? Which perhaps not everybody is doing. So you're kind of managing it on your own emails?
Yes, we manage it the way we manage other patients on the waiting list. We have that list there, and we at the end of the month, or just like 1 week into the next month, we decide, actually, can we just roll that over, because they did a check last year. They didn't do it the year before, but they did it the year before as well. So they seem to be doing a check every couple of years. That's absolutely fine. They're not complaining. We haven't heard from them. They're grown-ups. They should tell us when there's a problem. That is a bit more patient-led then.
So just one final question, if you can answer quickly. Jasmine asks, what reasons would you not invite someone to do remote check?
So the patients who don't have the equipment can't do it. The patients who don't have smartphones can't do it. But otherwise, I think if there is a reason, if there's programming still to do, when we feel they don't have a stable map yet and they still need programming, then we wouldn't invite them for remote check yet. We would just keep them in clinic and see them there. But otherwise, it's not many reasons why I wouldn't. Obviously, somebody who's blind might not be, if there's other disabilities, or who's not doesn't have the dexterity. That's a judgment call you make from patient to patient. But otherwise, no, I think don't see why not.
Okay, so I'm going to close the questions there. Thank you so much, Kim. That's absolutely amazing. So honestly, you've really looked into this and you've built up such a kind of a base of knowledge and data here. It's amazing. So I'm hoping that is going to leave us all kind of enthused about remote check and how we can integrate it into our clinics for the patients that it's appropriate for. So we've had 45 people here, and it's been a great discussion and lots of questions. So thank you so much, Kim, and thank you everybody for taking an hour out of your day to join us. I'm going to close the meeting here.
Thanks very much. Bye. Thanks for the opportunity, Helen.